The morning of February 7th, 1943, broke cold and gray across the Tunisian hills near Sidi Bou Zid. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber crouched behind a shattered stone wall, watching through his field glasses as American tanks retreated in disorder across the valley below. His heart pounded with a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine curiosity. After 3 years of fighting British Matildas, Crusaders, and the occasional Grant, he was finally getting his first close look at the new American machine everyone had been talking about, the M4 Sherman. The Americans had left 3 of them behind, abandoned in the chaos of their withdrawal. One lay on its side in a ditch, track blown off. Another sat motionless near a burned-out farmhouse, hatches hanging open like the mouth of a dead fish. The third stood intact at the edge of an olive grove, seemingly undamaged, just sitting there as if waiting for someone to climb inside and drive it away. Weber's company commander, Hauptmann Dietrich Müller, appeared at his elbow. "What do you think, Friedrich?" "I think," Weber said slowly, lowering his binoculars, "that the Americans fight like they build everything else, with quantity, not quality. Look at them run. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today." But even as Weber spoke those words, even as he watched the American retreat with the confidence of a veteran who had spent 2 years demolishing British armor in North Africa, a small seed of doubt had already been planted in his mind. Because that Sherman sitting in the olive grove, it didn't look damaged at all. And in Weber's experience, soldiers didn't abandon functioning tanks unless something had gone terribly wrong, unless they were green troops who panicked, or unless they knew something the enemy didn't. "Send word to battalion," Müller ordered. "Tell them we've captured intact American armor. Request recovery team and technical examination unit." Weber nodded, but his eyes never left that Sherman in the grove. Standard operating procedure required they sweep for booby traps before approaching any abandoned enemy equipment. The British had taught them that lesson the hard way at El Alamein, where enthusiastic German soldiers had been killed trying to claim souvenirs from abandoned positions. The Italians had been even worse about it, rushing into abandoned British camps only to trigger carefully placed explosives. Still an intact Sherman, that was intelligence gold. Every German officer from Rommel down to platoon commanders wanted to know what the Americans had brought to North Africa. The rumors coming from the testing grounds at Kummersdorf spoke of surprisingly good engineering, reliable engines, and production numbers that seemed impossible. But rumors were just rumors. Weber needed to see for himself. By mid-afternoon, a recovery team had arrived with a Bergerpanzer III and a technical intelligence officer named Lieutenant Hans Schreiber, a former mechanical engineer from Stuttgart, who now spent his days examining captured enemy equipment. Schreiber was a thin, nervous man who wore spectacles and carried a leather-bound notebook everywhere, filling it with detailed sketches and measurements. "Before we touch anything," Schreiber announced to the assembled group, "we follow protocol. Oberfeldwebel Krause, sweep the area." Oberfeldwebel Ernst Krause was a grizzled veteran who had been clearing mines and booby traps since Poland in 1939. He approached the task with the methodical patience of a man who understood that haste killed. For 30 minutes, he and his 2-man team moved around the Sherman in ever-tightening circles, probing the ground with steel rods, examining the tank's exterior for tripwires, checking the hatches for pull igniters, looking for any disturbance in the soil that might indicate a buried charge. "Clean," Krause finally announced. "No external traps, but I recommend extreme caution opening hatches. The Americans may have rigged the interior." Weber watched as Schreiber climbed onto the Sherman's hull with exaggerated care, testing each handhold before committing his weight. The lieutenant pulled a small mirror on a telescoping rod from his pack and used it to examine the edges of the commander's cupola, looking for wires or pressure plates. Finding nothing, he carefully lifted the hatch. "Clear," he called down. "No visible traps on the hatch mechanism." But as Schreiber lowered himself into the turret, Weber noticed something odd. The American crew had left in a hurry, certainly. There were personal items scattered about, canteens, a magazine, someone's wallet lying on the floor. But the radio had been smashed. Deliberately smashed, not damaged by enemy fire. The breech of the main gun had been spiked with a steel rod jammed into the mechanism. Even some of the vision ports had been cracked from the inside. "They disabled it before leaving," Schreiber's voice echoed up from inside the tank. "Professional work, not a panic abandonment." That observation troubled Weber more than he wanted to admit. In his experience, crews who took the time to properly disable their equipment were crews who knew they might lose it but weren't careless. They were trained, disciplined troops who followed procedures even under fire. Over the next 3 hours, Schreiber conducted a thorough examination of the Sherman, while Weber and several other officers observed. What they discovered challenged some assumptions and confirmed others. The armor was adequate but not exceptional. 51 millimeters on the frontal hull, sloped at 56 degrees. Any German 75 millimeter anti-tank gun could defeat it at reasonable range. The suspension was remarkably simple, almost crude compared to German designs, but also remarkably robust. The engine bay revealed a Continental R975 radial aircraft engine, a design choice that seemed almost comically American in its practical pragmatism. "It's like they built a tank the way they build tractors," Müller observed. "Simple, reliable, easy to repair." "Simple means more can be built," Schreiber countered, scribbling notes. "Look at this transmission. A farm mechanic could work on this. Now compare it to our Maybach gearboxes. Precision engineering, yes, but how many trained mechanics does it require? How many spare parts? How much factory time?" Weber said nothing, but he was thinking about the intelligence briefings he'd attended in January. American war production numbers that German analysts had initially dismissed as Allied propaganda. Numbers claiming the United States was producing thousands of tanks per month, numbers that seemed physically impossible. But if the Sherman was designed this way, designed for mass production, rather than individual perfection, then maybe those numbers weren't propaganda at all. "Hauptmann," one of Schreiber's assistants called out. He was examining the interior of the turret with a flashlight. "You should see this." Inside the turret, stenciled in English on the ammunition racks, was a production date, December 1942, just 2 months ago. This tank was fresh from the factory, shipped across the Atlantic, transported across North Africa, and now sitting captured in Tunisia. The speed of that movement implied logistical capabilities that Weber found genuinely disturbing. "How many of these did you count during the American attack this morning?" Müller asked. Weber had to think. 30, perhaps 40? And this is one of how many American divisions in North Africa? 1st Armored Division, one of perhaps 3 or 4 divisions total. The mathematics was simple but troubling. If each American armored division had 200 tanks, and they had 4 divisions, that was 800 tanks just in North Africa. And those were just the ones deployed here. How many more were being built right now in American factories? How many were being shipped to England for the eventual invasion of Europe? As the sun set over the Tunisian hills, painting the captured Sherman in orange and gold, Weber found himself looking at the machine with new eyes. It wasn't an impressive tank, not in the way a Panzer IV or a Tiger was impressive. It had no technical innovations that would make German engineers weep with envy. But there was something profoundly unsettling about its very ordinariness, its frank admission that it was built to be produced by the thousands, operated by hastily trained crews, and replaced when destroyed. The German army built tanks like craftsmen built fine watches, each one a small masterpiece of precision engineering. The Americans built tanks like they built automobiles, functional, standardized, mass-produced. And in a war of attrition, Weber was beginning to suspect which philosophy would prove superior. "Load it onto the Bergerpanzer," Müller ordered. "Berlin will want to examine this. Kummersdorf has been requesting an intact Sherman for months." As the recovery crew hooked chains to the Sherman's hull and prepared to tow it away, Weber walked back to his position behind the stone wall. In the distance, he could still see dust clouds where the American forces had withdrawn. They would regroup, reinforce, return, and when they did, they would bring more Shermans, many more. 3 days later, Weber stood in a different captured position, examining another abandoned American vehicle, this time a half-track. The Americans had left dozens of vehicles behind in their retreat, more equipment than Weber had ever seen abandoned by British forces. It seemed wasteful, almost criminal, until he remembered that production date stenciled inside the Sherman's turret. December 1942. If they were already building Shermans in December, and this was only February, how many more had rolled off the assembly line since then? How many more were on ships crossing the Atlantic right now? The half-track had also been professionally disabled, radio destroyed, engine drained of oil, key components removed or broken. But what struck Weber most was a detail so small he almost missed it. Stamped on the vehicle's data plate was a manufacturer's name he recognized: General Motors, the same company that built Buick and Chevrolet automobiles. The Americans had converted civilian automotive factories into military production facilities, an entire industry mobilized for war. "Hauptmann Weber," a runner approached, saluting. "Hauptmann Müller requests you at command post immediately." At the command post, Weber found Müller studying a map alongside Battalion Intelligence Officer Mayor Kurt Hoffmann. "Friedrich," Müller greeted him. "Tell the Major what you observed about the captured Sherman." Weber recounted his observations, the simple construction, the mass production design, the recent manufacture date. Hoffmann listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grim. "Your observations align with reports from other sectors," Hoffmann said finally. "In the past month, we've captured or examined 17 American tanks. Not one of them is more than 4 months old. Most are less than 2 months from factory to battlefield." "That suggests substantial production capacity," Weber said carefully. "It suggests," Hoffmann replied, "that we may have severely underestimated American industrial potential. Our intelligence estimates suggested the Americans might produce 800 to 1,000 tanks monthly. Recent analysis of capture rates, unit identifications, and production dates suggests the real number may be 3 to 4 times higher." The room fell silent. Weber felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. 3 to 4,000 tanks per month. That was more than Germany's entire tank production for all of 1942. "Major," Weber said slowly, "if those numbers are accurate, then the mathematics of this war changes completely." "Yes," Hoffmann agreed. "It does." That evening, Weber sat outside his tent, smoking a cigarette and watching the North African stars. He thought about the Sherman in the olive grove, about its crude simplicity and its recent manufacture date. He thought about German tank production, about the magnificent Tigers and Panthers being designed in Germany, technically superior to any Allied tank, but produced in such small numbers that they could never be everywhere they were needed. The Americans didn't need technically superior tanks. They just needed enough of them. And from everything Weber had seen, They had, or soon would have, more than enough. A month later, in March of 1943, Weber's unit participated in the Battle of El Guitar. The Americans attacked with overwhelming numbers, and for the first time Weber watched German positions simply get buried under the weight of American materiel. Shermans advanced in waves, and when one was knocked out, two more appeared to replace it. American artillery fired with a profligacy that seemed almost obscene. Dozens of shells, where German units would fire 3 or 4 to conserve ammunition. After the battle, as Weber's unit withdrew yet again, he passed more abandoned American equipment. Trucks, jeeps, even another Sherman that had thrown a track. All of it would be examined, all of it would be analyzed, and none of it would change the fundamental calculus of the war. Because the real secret wasn't in the tanks themselves. The real secret was in the factories that built them, in the industrial base that could produce them faster than they could be destroyed, in the logistical system that could ship them around the world. The Sherman wasn't a war machine. It was a symptom of something much larger, a fully mobilized industrial democracy operating at a scale Germany had never imagined possible. As summer turned to autumn in 1943, Weber found himself assigned to a new posting, training officer for tank destroyer units in France. He would spend the next year preparing German forces for the inevitable Allied invasion of Western Europe, teaching them how to fight American armor, how to recognize Sherman variants, how to target their weaknesses. But late at night, alone with his thoughts, Weber would remember that first Sherman in the olive grove near Sidi Bouzid. He would remember thinking the Americans fought with quantity rather than quality, built simple machines rather than technical marvels. And he would understand, with absolute clarity, that he had been watching the future of warfare, a future where victory belonged not to the finest machines or the best soldiers, but to the nation that could produce the most of both and keep producing them no matter what the cost. The captured Sherman from Sidi Bouzid eventually made its way to Kummersdorf for technical analysis, where German engineers confirmed everything Weber had observed. Simple, reliable, mass-producible. In their technical reports, they noted its weaknesses: inadequate armor, relatively weak gun, high profile. But they also noted something more troubling: a design philosophy that prioritized production speed over individual quality, that assumed losses would be replaced quickly, that treated tanks as expendable resources in a war of industrial attrition. In their final assessment, the Kummersdorf engineers wrote a single line that would prove more prophetic than anyone realized at the time. This tank is not designed to win battles. It is designed to win the war. By late 1943, as German forces retreated across North Africa and prepared for the defense of Italy and France, the truth about American production became impossible to ignore. Intelligence reports documented thousands of Shermans now deployed globally, in North Africa, preparing in England, heading to the Pacific, even being shipped to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. The numbers that had seemed like propaganda in early 1943 were revealed to be conservative estimates, and behind those numbers stood something even more frightening: an industrial base that was still growing, still expanding, still ramping up production. The factories building Shermans in December 1942 were now producing twice as many. New factories were opening every month. And unlike German industry, which was being steadily destroyed by Allied bombing, American factories operated in perfect safety, 3,000 miles from the nearest enemy bomber. Weber never saw combat again after his posting to France. On June the 6th, 1944, when the Allies launched their invasion of Normandy, he was in a training facility near Orléans, teaching new recruits how to ambush Sherman tanks. He heard the news of the landings by radio, heard about the massive Allied armored force that came ashore, heard the reports of American troops advancing inland behind waves of, what else, M4 Sherman tanks. He thought of that morning in Tunisia, 18 months earlier, when he'd watched American tanks retreat and felt confident in German superiority. He thought of all the lessons learned since then, all the captured Shermans examined, all the intelligence reports read and filed and forgotten. And he understood, finally, that the war had been lost not on any battlefield, but in the factories and shipyards and assembly lines of a nation that had transformed itself into an industrial juggernaut. The Americans didn't need better tanks. They just needed enough tanks, and they had built enough to bury the entire Wehrmacht under sheer weight of steel. The winter of 1943 arrived with bitter cold across the Eastern Front, and with it came a fundamental shift in German tactical doctrine. Oberfeldwebel Ernst Krause, the same soldier who had carefully swept that Sherman near Sidi Bouzid for booby traps, now found himself teaching younger soldiers a very different set of skills: how to rig abandoned equipment with explosives. The German retreat from North Africa had ended in May of 1943 with the surrender of over 250,000 Axis troops in Tunisia. Those who escaped, like Krause, brought with them hard-earned lessons about American capabilities. But they also brought something else, a grim understanding that retreat was no longer temporary, and that every piece of equipment left behind could become a weapon if used correctly. Krause stood in a frozen field outside Vitebsk in Belarus, demonstrating booby-trap techniques to a group of engineering troops who looked far too young to be wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. The youngest couldn't have been more than 17 fresh-faced boys who still believed Germany would win if they just fought hard enough. "Pay attention!" Krause barked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "When we abandon a position, and we will abandon positions, every single item we leave behind must be considered. Furniture, supplies, weapons, vehicles, especially vehicles." He gestured to a knocked-out Panzer III sitting nearby, its turret blown off by a Soviet anti-tank round. The tank was genuinely destroyed, useless for combat, but Krause had spent the morning converting it into a deadly trap. The enemy sees an abandoned tank. He wants to examine it. Natural curiosity. Maybe he thinks he can salvage parts. Maybe he wants intelligence about our capabilities. Maybe he just wants a trophy photograph. Krause walked around the Panzer, pointing out his handiwork. "I've rigged the commander's hatch with a ZZ-35 pull fuse connected to a 2-kilogram demolition charge. Anyone opening that hatch triggers the detonator. I've also placed a second charge under the engine deck, pressure activated, and a third inside the turret ring, rigged to detonate if anyone tries to enter from below." One of the young soldiers raised his hand tentatively. "Oberfeldwebel, what if our own forces try to recover the vehicle?" "Then they follow procedure," Krause snapped. "They check for traps before touching anything. The enemy won't, the Americans especially. They're confident, curious, and in a hurry. That makes them careless." But even as Krause spoke those words, he remembered that Sherman in Tunisia, professionally disabled, carefully abandoned. Those Americans hadn't been careless. They had followed their own procedures, denied the enemy useful intelligence, and withdrawn in good order. The Americans he fought now, in late 1943, were not the same inexperienced troops from early that year. Still, doctrine was doctrine. German forces in retreat were now systematically booby-trapping everything they couldn't take with them. The practice had been used occasionally in North Africa and extensively on the Eastern Front since 1941, but by late 1943 it had become standard operating procedure. Every abandoned position, every disabled vehicle, every seemingly harmless object left behind became a potential weapon. The techniques were sophisticated. Teller anti-tank mines were rigged with dual fuses, one obvious, one hidden. When enemy engineers carefully disarmed the obvious fuse, the hidden one detonated. Stick grenades were placed under attractive souvenirs, Luger pistols, iron cross medals, even photographs. Pull igniters were attached to furniture, doors, windows. Pressure plates were hidden under seemingly stable floorboards. Entire buildings were wired to collapse when key structural supports were disturbed, but vehicles presented special opportunities. An abandoned tank was inherently interesting to enemy forces, particularly to intelligence officers eager to examine German technology. Krause's specialty had become making those examinations as dangerous as possible. The goal, he explained to his students, is not just to kill enemy soldiers, though that's welcome. The goal is to slow them down, make them afraid, force them to waste time checking everything. When the enemy knows we booby-trap equipment, he has to treat every abandoned position like a minefield. That buys time for our main forces to establish new defensive lines. Over the following months, as German forces retreated from the Soviet Union and prepared for the inevitable Allied invasion of France, the doctrine spread throughout the Wehrmacht. Special training courses were established. Field manuals were updated with new techniques. Engineers became experts in what the official documents called spring-fallen, explosive traps. By the spring of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for D-Day, German coastal defenses in France weren't just fortified with concrete bunkers and minefields. Every potential fallback position had been pre-rigged with demolition charges. Bridges were wired for destruction. Buildings near the beaches were turned into traps. And standing orders required that any equipment abandoned during retreat be rendered not just useless, but dangerous to touch. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The irony was not lost on soldiers like Krause. In 1940, during the invasion of France, German forces had advanced so quickly that booby traps were irrelevant. The Wehrmacht had captured Paris in 6 weeks, pushing the Allies into the sea at Dunkirk. Now, 4 years later, they were preparing to fight that same battle in reverse, slowly, grudgingly, desperately, leaving destruction in their wake. But the Allies had learned too. By 1944, British and American forces had extensive experience with German booby traps. Specialized engineer units were trained in trap detection and disarmament. Protocols were established requiring thorough sweeps of any captured position before occupation, and intelligence briefings warned troops about the specific techniques Germans employed. The cat-and-mouse game escalated. Germans began using dummy traps, obvious, easily detected explosive devices that would be found and disarmed, causing soldiers to let down their guard before encountering the real trap hidden nearby. They used time delay fuses that would detonate hours or even days after a position was captured. They rigged false walls and hidden compartments with devastating secondary charges. One documented incident from the Italian campaign illustrated the sophistication of these tactics. British forces advancing through a small town near Cassino in February of 1944 found an intact German command post. The building appeared to have been hastily abandoned. Maps still on tables, radios partially dismantled, personal items scattered about. A painting on the wall hung crooked. The British officer in charge, a captain with experience in North Africa, immediately suspected a trap. He ordered his men to enter through a window rather than the obvious front door. Once inside, they discovered the expected booby trap, a Teller mine rigged to the door handle with a pull igniter. Congratulating themselves on their caution, they carefully disarmed it. The captain, being thorough, decided to straighten the crooked painting. It seemed like the sort of thing an officer would do, restoring order to chaos. Beneath the painting was a second Teller mine, also rigged with a pull igniter. The moment he moved the frame, he triggered the detonator. The explosion killed the captain and 2 sergeants. But the true sophistication of the trap became clear moments later, when the squad retreating from the building dove for cover in a convenient slit trench across the street. A third charge, buried in the trench and connected to the painting by a buried wire, detonated beneath them. 7 more men died. The Germans had anticipated not just that Allied forces would check for booby traps, but exactly how they would check, where they would take cover, and what a cautious officer would do after believing he had cleared the obvious danger. They had weaponized human psychology itself. Stories like this spread quickly through Allied ranks, creating exactly the psychological effect Germans intended. Soldiers became paranoid, seeing threats in every abandoned position. Progress slowed as engineers carefully swept each building, each vehicle, each seemingly innocent object. Trust eroded. Was that German soldier really dead? Or was his body rigged to explode when moved? Was that chocolate bar lying on a table a forgotten ration? Or was it attached to a grenade with the pin removed? Yet even as German forces perfected these defensive tactics, even as they created an art form from retreat and destruction, the fundamental mathematics of the war remained unchanged. For every Allied soldier killed by a booby trap, 10 more landed on the beaches or rolled off factory production lines. For every day German traps bought, American and British factories produced another 100 tanks, another 1,000 trucks, another mountain of supplies. Krause survived until April of 1944, when he was killed not by combat but by one of his own traps. During a hasty retreat from a position near the Eastern Front, he had rigged a disabled Stoogie-3 assault gun with multiple charges. Soviet forces advanced faster than expected, and in the confusion of withdrawal, a German recovery team attempted to salvage the vehicle without checking for traps. Krause rushed forward to warn them, but the lead mechanic had already opened the engine deck. The explosion killed 4 German soldiers, including Krause himself. It was a fitting end, perhaps, to a war that had turned increasingly self-destructive. The Wehrmacht was now so proficient at destroying its own equipment that it occasionally killed its own soldiers in the process. The psychological warfare that was meant to slow the enemy sometimes slowed German forces instead, as every disabled vehicle had to be treated as potentially dangerous, every abandoned position viewed with suspicion. By June of 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, both sides understood the deadly game completely. Germans knew their abandoned equipment would be rigged. Allied forces knew to expect traps, and yet the traps still claimed victims, because in the chaos and urgency of combat, protocol broke down. Soldiers got careless, or desperate, or simply unlucky. The beaches of Normandy were scattered with German defensive positions, many of them booby-trapped during the retreat inland. American engineers swept the bunkers and pillboxes, finding charges rigged to everything from doorways to ammunition boxes to the bodies of dead German soldiers. It was methodical, necessary work that saved countless lives, but it couldn't catch everything. On June 15, 1944, 9 days after D-Day, American forces advancing inland discovered what appeared to be an abandoned German Panzer IV tank, sitting intact in a Norman hedgerow. The tank was genuinely abandoned. Its crew had fled when American forces outflanked their position. But before leaving, they had followed their training. The radio was smashed, the main gun spiked, the engine drained of oil. And beneath the turret ring, accessible only from inside, was a 2-kilogram demolition charge rigged to a pressure-sensitive detonator. Lieutenant Robert Mitchell of the 2nd Armored Division climbed onto the Panzer to examine it. He was an experienced officer who had fought in North Africa, who knew German tactics, who understood the importance of checking for traps. He looked for tripwires around the exterior. He used a mirror to check the hatches. He found nothing suspicious. What Mitchell didn't know, couldn't have known, was that German engineering doctrine had evolved. The pressure plate inside the turret ring was designed to activate only after significant weight was applied. A careful examination from the hatch wouldn't trigger it. Only when someone actually entered the turret and moved around inside would their weight shift enough to close the circuit. Mitchell opened the commander's cupola and lowered himself inside. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. He examined the interior, noted the disabled equipment, and began to climb back out. As he pulled himself up, shifting his weight toward the hatch opening, the pressure plate finally activated. The explosion destroyed the tank's interior and killed Mitchell instantly. 2 other soldiers standing nearby were wounded by shrapnel. And across the American forces in Normandy, the word spread again. The Germans were still finding new ways to kill the careless and unlucky. Yet even these deadly innovations couldn't change the trajectory of the war. By July of 1944, American forces in Normandy were being supplied by a logistical system so vast it defied German comprehension. The beaches that had been battlefields weeks earlier were now massive supply depots. Liberty ships arrived daily, unloading thousands of tons of equipment. Temporary harbors called mulberries processed cargo at rates that would have been impossible for pre-war ports. And still the tanks came. Hundreds of Shermans, thousands of trucks, mountains of ammunition and fuel and spare parts. German booby traps might kill dozens of Allied soldiers. German anti-tank guns might destroy hundreds of Allied vehicles. But for every loss, 5 replacements arrived within days. The fundamental lesson that Friedrich Weber had learned examining that first Sherman in Tunisia was now playing out across all of Western Europe. Technical sophistication and tactical skill couldn't overcome industrial superiority. Germany had become extraordinarily proficient at defensive warfare, at making every retreating step as expensive as possible for the Allies. But retreat was still retreat, and expense was a cost the Allies could afford to pay. By August of 1944, German forces were in full withdrawal across France. The booby-trap doctrine that had been refined over years of fighting reached its apex. Entire towns were turned into death traps. Roads were seeded with mines. Bridges were demolished, and every piece of equipment that couldn't be evacuated was either destroyed or rigged to explode. In one documented incident from the retreat through France, American forces discovered an apparently intact German supply depot. Crates of ammunition, fuel drums, spare parts for vehicles, all left behind in seemingly usable condition. The depot was too large to abandon, too valuable to ignore. But the commander in charge, a colonel who had fought through North Africa, Sicily, and now France, ordered his engineers to spend 2 full days sweeping for traps before touching anything. They found charges rigged to 23 different locations, fuel drums with pressure detonators, ammunition crates with pull igniters, false floors hiding additional explosives. Even the walls had been drilled and packed with small charges designed to spray shrapnel when triggered. The engineers disarmed all 23 traps and declared the depot safe. On the 3rd day, when supply troops began moving material out of the depot, one soldier noticed something odd about a support beam. It looked slightly newer than the others, the wood a different color. He mentioned it to his sergeant, who called back the engineers. They discovered a 24th trap, a demolition charge on a 7-day time delay fuse, hidden inside a false beam and set to detonate long after the depot would be fully occupied and operational. That incident represented both the pinnacle of German defensive doctrine and its ultimate futility. Yes, German forces had created a trap so sophisticated it nearly succeeded. But they had also expended enormous effort and precious demolitions rigging an entire depot, effort that could have been spent on defensive positions, materials that could have been used to slow the Allied advance. And even if the trap had succeeded, even if it had killed dozens of American soldiers and destroyed a supply depot, 3 more depots' worth of material would arrive the next day from the beaches. The mathematics were inexorable. The Allies could afford to be cautious, to spend days sweeping positions for traps, because they had time and manpower to spare. Germany could not afford to keep retreating, because behind them was Berlin, and there was nowhere left to go. By the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces closed on Germany's borders, the booby-trap warfare that had seemed so clever, so innovative, revealed itself as a symptom of desperation. Nations advancing in victory don't need to booby-trap their abandoned equipment because they're not abandoning anything. Only nations in retreat perfect the art of making their withdrawal as painful as possible for the enemy. And retreat, no matter how skillful, no matter how costly for the pursuer, was still retreat. Every kilometer westward was a kilometer closer to German cities, to German families, to the industrial base that built the tanks and guns and shells that kept the Wehrmacht fighting. Meanwhile, American factories operated in perfect safety, 3,000 miles from the nearest enemy, producing more equipment in a month than Germany could build in a year. The real deception wasn't in the booby-trapped tanks or the false walls or the delayed action fuses. The real deception had been the belief, held by soldiers like Weber in early 1943, examining that first Sherman, that technical superiority and tactical skill could overcome industrial might. That Tiger tanks, despite their small numbers, could counter thousands of Shermans. That German engineering excellence could defeat American productive capacity. It was a comforting lie, believed by many in the Wehrmacht until far too late. And by the time the truth became undeniable, by the time soldiers understood that they weren't fighting enemy armies but enemy factories, the war was already lost. All that remained was the grim mathematics of retreat, destruction, and delay, buying time that would lead nowhere but to inevitable defeat. The spring of 1945 brought a peculiar kind of clarity to those German soldiers still fighting. The delusions that had sustained them through years of war had evaporated, replaced by a cold understanding of their situation. Major Kurt Hoffmann, the intelligence officer who had briefed Friedrich Weber about American production numbers back in 1943, now found himself in a bunker near the Ruhr Valley, reading the latest intelligence reports with a mixture of professional detachment and personal despair. The numbers told a story more devastating than any battlefield defeat. American tank production for 1944 had exceeded 40,000 units. 40,000. Germany had produced fewer than 30,000 tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers total during the entire war. The Americans had built more in a single year than Germany had managed in 6 years of conflict. And that was just tanks. Truck production, aircraft production, artillery production, every category showed the same overwhelming disparity. Hoffmann had spent 2 years trying to convince his superiors that American industrial capacity represented an existential threat. In 1943, his reports had been dismissed as defeatist. In 1944, they had been ignored as stating the obvious. Now, in 1945, with Allied forces closing from east and west, with German cities burning under strategic bombing, with supply lines collapsing and units disintegrating, everyone understood. But understanding changed nothing. The booby-trap doctrine that had seemed so clever in 1943 now appeared in its true light, a desperate improvisation by a losing power. German forces had become extraordinarily skilled at making retreat expensive, at turning every abandoned position into a death trap, at weaponizing their own withdrawal. But all the booby traps in the world couldn't stop Sherman tanks from rolling deeper into Germany, couldn't prevent B-17 bombers from destroying what remained of German industry, couldn't alter the fundamental reality that Germany was losing a war of attrition against enemies with effectively unlimited resources. On April 12, 1945, Hoffman received word that American forces had discovered a German tank training facility near Paderborn. The facility had been hastily evacuated days earlier, and following doctrine, the engineers had rigged the remaining vehicles with demolition charges. But something unexpected had happened. American engineers sweeping the facility had found the booby traps, all of them. They had photographed each trap in place, carefully documented the techniques used, and then systematically disarmed them. The photographs were being distributed throughout American forces as training material, showing soldiers exactly what to look for, exactly how German traps were rigged, exactly which hiding places were most commonly used. The Americans had taken the art of German defensive warfare and turned it into a training manual. They had industrialized the process of defeating booby traps, just as they had industrialized tank production. What had once required experienced engineers like Krauss now required only a checklist and basic training. The mystique had evaporated, replaced by procedure. Hoffman thought about Friedrich Weber, who had been killed during the Battle of the Bulge in December while commanding a Panther tank. Weber had spent the last year of his life fighting American Shermans in France, and his after-action reports had been remarkable for their brutal honesty. The technical weaknesses of American tanks remained: thin armor, weak guns, high profiles. But those weaknesses didn't matter when Americans could afford to lose 3 tanks destroying 1 Panther, then replace all 3 within a week. Weber had written in one of his final reports, "We are fighting equipment, not soldiers. When we destroy a Sherman, the enemy mourns 1 tank. When we lose a Panther, we mourn one of only a few hundred. The Americans treat tanks as ammunition, expendable resources to be used and replaced. We treat them as precious instruments to be preserved." This philosophical difference defines the war more than any technical specification. That philosophical difference was now playing out in its final stages. German forces in the field still possessed technical skill, tactical expertise, and individual courage. Panther and Tiger tanks, when they had fuel and ammunition, remained the most formidable armor on any battlefield. German anti-tank guns, properly positioned, could devastate American armor columns. German soldiers, even the undertrained and exhausted teenagers now filling the ranks, often fought with desperate determination. But none of it mattered anymore. The factories that built the Panthers were rubble. The refineries that produced fuel were destroyed. The rail networks that transported ammunition were shattered. And even when German forces achieved local tactical victories, destroying dozens of American vehicles and inflicting heavy casualties, the Americans simply brought up more men and equipment and attacked again the next day. The Allies had learned the lessons Germany had tried to teach them. They had learned to check for booby traps, to treat every abandoned position with suspicion, to follow protocols that minimized casualties from traps. Those protocols slowed their advance, yes, but the advance never stopped. And behind that advance came the supply network, the Red. Ball Express trucks, the Liberty ships, the railway engineers, the depot soldiers, the entire logistical apparatus that kept Allied forces fighting. By late April of 1945, Hoffman found himself overseeing the evacuation and destruction of intelligence materials. The orders were clear. Nothing of value was to fall into enemy hands. But what value remained? The Americans already knew everything about German tank production, German tactics, German capabilities. They had captured hundreds of German vehicles, examined them thoroughly, tested them extensively. German technical secrets had been revealed through simple observation of battlefield wreckage. The booby-trap manuals were being burned along with everything else. Hoffman watched the documents curl and blacken in the flames, and he wondered if some American intelligence officer would eventually write a report analyzing German defensive doctrine. Would they understand it as desperate innovation born of retreating necessity? Would they recognize the psychological warfare inherent in making every step of advance potentially lethal? Or would they simply file it away as another defeated enemy's failed tactics? On May 2, 1945, 6 days before Germany's unconditional surrender, Hoffman supervised the destruction of a final cache of disabled German vehicles near Flensburg. Following the doctrine that had been ingrained over years of retreat, engineering troops rigged the vehicles with demolition charges. Panthers, Tigers, assault guns, all the technical marvels that had once seemed unbeatable, now reduced to obstacles to be destroyed rather than let them become trophies for the victors. But Hoffman countermanded the order to rig the booby traps. There was no point anymore. The war was over in all but official declaration. The Americans knew all the tricks, and more importantly, the symbolic significance had reversed. Those booby-trapped vehicles were supposed to represent German defiance, German determination to make victory expensive even in defeat. Instead, they now represented only desperation, the futile gestures of a beaten army. "Just destroy them," Hoffman ordered. "Properly, no traps." The engineering officer looked surprised but didn't argue. Within hours, the vehicles were burning, reduced to twisted scrap metal by properly placed demolition charges. No hidden traps, no delayed fuses, no psychological warfare, just the end. A week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hoffman surrendered to British forces near Hamburg and spent the following months in a prisoner of war camp, where he had time to reflect on the war and its lessons. One day, an American intelligence officer came to interview him about German defensive tactics. The officer was polite, professional, and surprisingly well-informed. He showed Hoffman photographs of German booby traps, asked questions about the doctrine behind their placement, took careful notes. "Why do you want to know?" Hoffman asked. "You won. Our tactics failed." The American officer smiled slightly. "Your tactics didn't fail, Major. They accomplished exactly what they were designed to accomplish. They delayed us, forced us to be careful, killed some of our soldiers. But you're right that you lost. The question is why tactical success led to strategic failure. Because tactics can't overcome industrial capacity," Hoffman said. "We learned that too late." "Did you?" the American officer replied. "Because from where I sit, it looks like Germany knew about American production capacity from 1942 onward. We weren't hiding it. Our newspapers published production figures. Our politicians bragged about it. And still your high command acted as if technical superiority would be enough." Hoffman had no good answer to that. It was true. German intelligence had known, or should have known, about American industrial might. The reports had been filed, the numbers calculated, the implications drawn. But knowledge and belief were different things. It was easier to believe that German engineering excellence would triumph, that superior tactics would compensate for numerical inferiority, that one Tiger could defeat 10 Shermans, and that would somehow be enough. The Americans believed different things. They believed that adequate equipment in overwhelming numbers would triumph over excellent equipment in limited quantities. They believed that industrial capacity was a weapon as important as any tank or gun. They believed that a war of attrition could be won by the side capable of sustaining attrition indefinitely. And they had been proven right. In the prisoner of war camp, Hoffman encountered other German officers who had fought against American forces. They shared a common experience: initial confidence in German superiority giving way to growing dread as they realized the scale of American production, culminating in final understanding that the war had been mathematically unwinnable from the start. One former Panzer commander told Hoffman, "I destroyed 17 Shermans in France. 17. I was recommended for the Knight's Cross. And then I realized those 17 tanks were replaced within 2 weeks. All my kills, all my crew's skill, all our tactical victories, meaningless. We were fighting a factory, and you can't kill a factory with a tank gun." That was the truth that soldiers like Friedrich Weber had discovered too late, that Oberfeldwebel-Krause had died without fully understanding, that German high command had refused to accept until defeat became undeniable. Technical excellence, tactical skill, individual courage, all were necessary for winning battles. But wars were won by nations capable of producing enough equipment to outfit armies, enough fuel to move them, enough ammunition to sustain them, and enough industrial base to replace losses indefinitely. The Sherman tank was never designed to be superior to German armor. It was designed to be good enough, producible in massive quantities, reliable enough to cross oceans and continents, simple enough for hastily trained crews to operate, and cheap enough to be treated as expendable. In every single one of those design criteria, it succeeded brilliantly. The fact that individual Shermans were inferior to Panthers or Tigers was irrelevant when Americans could build 10 Shermans for every German heavy tank. The booby trap doctrine was the same story in miniature. German forces had become incredibly skilled at making retreat expensive, at weaponizing withdrawal, at killing enemy soldiers with abandoned equipment. But that skill was itself a symptom of retreat. Advancing armies don't need to booby-trap what they're leaving behind, because they're not leaving anything behind. Only defeated armies perfect the art of turning their own equipment into weapons for the enemy, because that equipment would be captured anyway. By the time Hoffman was released from the prisoner of war camp in 1946, the world had moved on. The Allied armies that had conquered Germany were being demobilized. The factories that had produced thousands of tanks monthly were retooling for peacetime production. The vast military machine that had seemed unstoppable was being deliberately disassembled, its pieces returned to civilian life. But the lessons remained. The Sherman tank, which German propaganda had mocked as inferior, and which German soldiers had learned to respect for its numbers, became the symbol of American military production. Over 50,000 had been built during the war. 50,000. More than the combined tank production of Germany, Britain, and Italy. The number itself was more impressive than any technical specification. And those Shermans had gone everywhere. To Britain for D-Day, to North Africa for the desert campaigns, to Italy for the grueling fight up the peninsula, to the Pacific for island-hopping campaigns against Japan, to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, where they fought on the Eastern Front alongside T-34s. The same tank, mass-produced and distributed globally, became the workhorse of Allied armored forces in every theater. German tanks, for all their technical sophistication, never achieved that kind of global presence. Tigers and Panthers were concentrated on critical fronts, used sparingly, preserved when possible. They were too complex to build in large numbers, too expensive to treat as expendable, too technically demanding to be operated by hastily trained crews. They were masterpieces of engineering in an era that demanded mass production. Hoffman spent his remaining years after the war teaching history at a university in Hamburg. He never forgot the lessons learned too late, and he made sure his students understood them. When teaching about World War II, he always emphasized the same point. Tactical brilliance cannot overcome strategic weakness. Germany had possessed superior individual technology, better trained soldiers, more experienced commanders, and Germany had lost decisively because it lacked the industrial capacity to sustain a long war against enemies who could afford to trade casualties for time and space. The booby-trapped Sherman that never existed, the deliberate plant, the intelligence bait, the perfect trap, that would have been brilliant psychological warfare. But it wasn't necessary. The real Shermans, examined by German intelligence from Tunisia to France, told a more devastating truth than any trap could have. They revealed an enemy who could afford to build tanks by the thousands, who could ship them around the world, who could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted, who had transformed their entire industrial economy into a military production machine. And that truth, more than any explosive charge or delayed fuse or hidden trap, was what broke German confidence. Not a single devastating surprise, but the grinding realization that they were fighting an enemy who could lose every battle and still win the war through sheer attrition. An enemy who treated individual tanks the way Germany treated individual shells, as expendable ammunition in a larger conflict. The Americans never needed to booby-trap their Shermans. They just needed to keep building them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe. Perfect. I've analyzed your script and title. Here are the 18 image search lines, each representing approximately 435 words of narration, plus the bonus thumbnail line.